Welcome to sewing 4 and 3 thread overlock on your Bernina L660 and L650. I'm Doris Breckbuhl, educator and overlock specialist at Bernina International. In this video, I will show you how you set up your machine for 4 thread overlock, how you perform a sewing test, and also, for example, how you can begin and end a seam in a circle. In the description below, you'll find a detailed list of all contents in this video, so you can easily navigate to those topics that interest you most. Stretchy seams with 4 and 3 thread overlock. We select a stitch using the stitch chart. For example, 4 thread overlock. We set the defaults using the stitch chart. Thread tensions to 4, cutting width to 6, rolled hem overlock to 0, stitch length to 3, MTC, differential feed, and presser foot pressure are at defaults. MTC 0, differential feed at 1, presser foot pressure on M. If you haven't threaded yet, find here the link to the threading video. And if you like more information about settings, also a link to the video. An overlock chain is also built without fabric. If the chain is formed, we can assume we've threaded correctly. When sewing, I recommend to always cut a little bit of fabric, which means a seam allowance of about 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch is a good idea. So, sewing with the left needle, we can align the seam allowance to the left needle, guiding the fabric along the edge of the foot, for example. Cutting a bit of seam allowance makes that less dust and fluff accumulates in the machine. I check my stitch for its looks and functions, such as, for example, stretchiness, and continue. Towards the end of the seam, overlock stitches are usually sewn over the edge, as another seam will follow. I check my stitch for looks and function. 4 thread overlock is ideal for seams in knits and woven fabrics. 4 thread overlock is ideal for woven fabrics with or without stretch, to combine different quality fabrics, for cuffs and heavier materials, to sew in elastics, for edges on your neckline, for finer or softer fabrics, and of course also you can use it as a decorative stitch. Let's have a brief look at 3 thread overlock, a stitch that's very often overlooked. 3 thread overlock you can sew wide with left needle or narrow with right needle. 3 thread overlock is ideal for neatening stretchy materials, here for example a narrow stitch. It is also ideal for really stretchy seams, for example in t-shirts, for medium weight fabrics, stretchy or woven for neatening and seaming. You can use it for woven fabrics with or without stretch. This is a wide 3 thread overlock. For neatening and seaming, you can use it for quilting, if you like. For heavier fabrics, a wide 3 thread overlock. It's also ideal to sew in elastic, wide or narrow, for cuffs, and of course a 3-thread overlock is also very nice for a decorative edge, wide or narrow. If you're not sure which stitch to use, on the second page of the stitch overview you'll find the Creative Consultant. You may select your fabric, your sewing technique, and we have a recommendation of the stitches that would be suitable for that technique. If you like to stitch in a circle or do some tubular project, I have a tip for ending the seam nicely. I have already prepared the machine with 3-thread overlock with left needle, and I find it easier when the stitch is loose and not forming a chain. For the seam begin, I pre-cut the seam allowance. Then I place my fabric under the presser foot. The mark for the cutting width will help me guide. Approaching the end of the circle, I bring my threads away. When no more need for cutting is, I can deactivate the knife, and now the marks of my needle will help me guide precisely. I sew approx 3 stitches over the first stitches. Then I raise the presser foot and pull the needle thread between presser foot and fabric. Then I remove my project, and I have a very nice and flat ending in a circle. This is of course ideal when you sew decorative stitches in a circle. It can also be used for sewing rolled hems or narrow seams, but more on the technique with rolled hems and narrow seams in our video tutorial about rolled hems. Before you continue sewing, don't forget to activate the knife again. When I activate the knife, it comes up only a little bit. To have it in full cutting position, sew a couple of stitches. In case you're not satisfied with your sewing test result, let's now have a look at stitch optimization, also known as balancing the stitch. Fabric, needle and thread influence your stitch. If you want to approach the theme from a neutral perspective, I recommend you sew yourself some samples. I prepared some samples where I've been playing with thread tension first. I've been playing with left needle thread tension from 1 to 4 to 9, and you see how different my sewing result looks. Same with the right needle, tension 1, 4 and 9. Upper looper thread tension 1, 4, 9, and lower looper thread tension 1, 4 and 9. So you see what the tensions are capable of doing for you and your stitch. And you may also consider that your fabric behaves differently, whether you sew at the bias, across the fabric, or a stretchy fabric, and along a fabric, whether it's knit or woven. But now let's look at an example. I've threaded my machine with 4-thread overlock using a texturized thread in the loopers. A fine texturized thread can also be used in the needles. I start my sewing test with the default settings, which means thread tensions at 4, stitch length 3, differential 1, pressure foot pressure medium, padding with 6, MTC 0. And you will also notice when you do your testing, the same stitch in default setting will turn out differently on different fabrics. A general rule is that you have to decrease one tension first before you can increase another, to have the threads loosely interlock. And here we see from the very beginning my stitch is not to my expectations. The upper looper thread is too tight, and on the underside the needle thread, the left needle thread, is pulled out too far. That means I have to decrease one tension first, definitely the upper looper thread. Let me bring it down to 2.5. And the result is significant. On the upper side, it looks very nice. And on the underside, still too much needle thread, or maybe not enough lower looper thread. I would decrease the lower looper tension first, let's say from 4 to 3.5, one step at a time. And no, it's not showing the result I like. So back with the lower looper tension to 4, and I increase the left needle to 4.5. So it looks still nice on the upper side, and also the underside of the stitch is nice now. And it fulfills the purpose of being stretchy. What I can also do to achieve a nice stitch and seam, I would even increase the stitch length from 3 to 3.5, for example. Compared to my last result, I like this one better. On the upper side and on the underside. And it's still stretchy enough for my seam. Increasing the stitch length may be not good for another of your fabrics. For example, if you have a very stretchy fabric, that's not the right direction to go. In this case, I would decrease the stitch length to keep my stitch flat when relaxed and still stretchy. The stitch length is also some optimization part you define with your sewing test. And especially when changing the needle thread tensions, I recommend to go step by step in small steps to keep elasticity where needed. Let me show 2 other examples where I tried to optimize. I could see from the sewing result on the upper side something's not quite right here, and on the lower side of the stitch a very loose right needle thread. What has happened here is that after threading, my right needle thread jumped out of the pre-tension. Maybe I have not been clicking it in properly. And then I got this very, very loose thread tension. No thread tension, actually. Another example is this. Already on the upper side, it didn't look nice. I checked the underside, regular, but not to my expectations. I tried to increase the tension. No result. What happened here is, while threading, I had my presser foot down. So the thread was only laying over the tension discs and not slip in between. So when I checked my threading path, I noticed, something wrong. Always make sure that you have your presser foot up when threading or changing a thread. When optimizing 3-thread overlock stitches, the procedure is the same, but you need to concentrate on one needle thread tension only, either the left or the right. Here I have prepared a sample with embroidery thread on fine tuft, neatening the edge, wide or narrow. Although this thread is very fine, it requires a lower tension because of the higher friction of the thread. But now to an example which often occurs when neatening fine woven fabrics with 3-thread overlock: seam puckering. To avoid seam puckering, there are different approaches. I have set my machine for 3-thread overlock with right needle, set all tensions at default 4, stitch length at 3, differential feet to 1, presser foot pressure to M, and cutting width to 6. And you can already see it very well. My fabric is puckering very lightly. First approach most often is changing differential feet from 1 to 0.7. I will go down directly to 0.7. You can go anywhere between. And the result is from a puckering piece of seam to a flat. So that's one approach. I set differential feet back to 1. My second approach would be I can decrease the right needle thread tension, for example, down to 3.5. It's still puckering, but it still looks nice on the upper side and on the lower side. So I could decrease a little bit more, maybe. But my third approach is usually shortening the stitch length. So I go back to the default tension. And adjust the stitch length from 3 to 2.5 down to a little bit above 2, which makes a nice and flat seam, nice on the upper side and nice on the underside of the stitch. And now I can decide which is the optimization I go with in my project. And there's a tip when sewing with decorative threads for decorative edges. Sew slow, but at a regular speed. When using the 660, you can use the speed slider to reduce the max speed. On the L650, you control it with your foot control. Let me summarize. Independent of the stitch you're sewing, when fine-tuning the thread tensions, always decrease one tension first before tightening another. More on optimizing the different stitches, such as flat lock, wrapped overlock, super stretch, refer to your instruction manual for all the details. In general, optimizations can be achieved with fine-tuning thread tensions, amending stitch length, differential feed, presser foot pressure, or cutting width and MTC. For more on the different settings, please refer to our video on settings of your L660 and L650. If you like to try and learn more, my tip for unpicking 4 and 3 thread overlock may come in handy. I recommend to cut the needle threads on the upper side every 10 or 20 centimeters, 4 or 8 inches. Then you can pull out the right needle thread with a tapestry needle. That comes out quite comfortably. And after the right needle thread, you may pull out the left needle thread. That's a bit tighter. Because afterwards you can simply lift off the looper threads. And you don't have to pull out little small bits and pieces. That's how easy you can undo a 4 or even easier a 3 thread overlock. Of course, there's much more on overlock stitches than what you've seen in this video. I recommend you visit the Bernina blog, the Skill Hub on our website, or use the Big Book of Serging. And also your dealer offers classes in-store or online. If you click on the link, you'll find more tutorials on your Bernina L660 and L650. If one of these tips has been helpful, give us a like. And we would love it if you subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Bernina, made to create.